I'm gonna move on because I'd rather have time at the end if we have time at the end.
Oh, may I suggest
Sure.
that you start by telling everybody the details for meeting up for the field trip?
Oh, I see.
Just in case we lose it at the end.
Yeah, there will be an email sometime tomorrow with some more details because I'm still trying to check out this red knot situation. And I'll be scouting it on Saturday afternoon and then again with the Talbot County Bird Club on Sunday.
Wow.
But I will send directions. We are going to meet at Bombay Hook National Wildlife Refuge Visitor Center. And I will send you the coordinates. We'll meet there at 8 o'clock. There are restrooms available. The visitor center may or may not be open. I'm never clear as to when the power's off.
Question at 8.
8 o'clock a.m.
Not 7.
That's right, 8 o'clock a.m.
Okay.
But those who want to carpool from Easton, I won't be there to herd the cats. But if you wish to meet there and hitch a ride with other colleagues that you haven't arranged with ahead of time, that's at 6:30. And that'll be near the Dunkin' Donuts in the Acme parking lot. That's our usual rendezvous for places like the Talbot County Bird Club. Most people know that location. It's behind what used to be Accurate Optical, what is it now, Mattress something. But that would be at 6:30. It takes about an hour and a half to get to the visitor center. And we'll do a little birding around the visitor center. There's some scrub habitat there. We'll look for some migrants and a couple of other species. So we won't just head off into nowhere. But in any case, that's the place, and I will also send my cell phone number and other such things. This is Monday, the 23rd, not the 19th,
I
or
got
whatever it
that.
was I had before.
Yeah, I changed that for the memo.
It's
I saw
this
that.
Monday.
And I will send more information by later on Friday, sometime by Friday evening, if not sooner, with the details. I don't think anything's going to change, but what I am hoping is to maybe hear some more information about the red knot. And that'll be kind of the bird we want to see then. This is all about amazing shorebirds. And so a couple of other things just to cover. If you get Audubon magazine, hey, it's in focus now. What do we want?
Cool.
That's
This
because
was all blurred before.
we trained you.
Art. But Audubon magazine, the latest issue, which is spring 2022, covers a lot of the information that I had put in the first lecture or two when we were talking about migration. It talks about the various types of banding and other types of transmitters they're using. Its paradigm bird is the blackpoll warbler. This is a fall edition of the blackpoll warbler. We saw several of them migrating north just the other day at Susquehanna State Park with the Talbot Bird Club. But in any case, that, where I used some other species, they're using this one, but it does cover a lot of the details. And I will also send a link to the article, the principal article in here. I'll send a link you can get online. If you don't get Audubon, you can see most of the meat on an online version. So I think you'd enjoy that if you want to kind of review what we're learning about bird migration and how we're learning about it. Because as you know, we're learning a lot of new things. Things like fledglings don't necessarily leave the area in which they were fledged. We're learning a lot about site fidelity of birds coming back to the same places. And you're going to see more about that today. And finally, one last word. Last time I talked about wisdom. Remember wisdom? The Laysan albatross?
Yes.
That was 69 or so years old, was banded by our friend Shan Robbins a long time ago, and I had reported that it had not been seen last year. We were concerned that its legacy was about to end. Well, in fact, there's been an update. It was seen last year in November. It returned a day early to its nesting site. This is a she. She was just in time, as one person said, for her 70th birthday because she was banded just shortly thereafter, 70 years ago. She did not nest this year, and her mate of several years was not with her. But Laysan albatrosses, as do many other seabirds, occasionally skip a year. So there is still hope. There is no reason to think yet that she is not going to come back this November. But she, at least as of December of last year, she was still alive, 70 years old, the oldest living bird species that we have. Wow, isn't that incredible?
Wow.
Albatross.
Wow,
That is-
Racing albatross and Midway Island. Okay, this is our final class of the four dealing with special birds in special places. And these birds really are special. And a lot of you folks don't know a lot about them because other than seeing sandpipers at the beach in the summertime and maybe a killdeer or two, you don't know much about shorebirds, but they are truly amazing. And I've had a variety of other adjectives that I've been using in editing my files, and I keep forgetting which one I'm using. But amazing is the one I think I put in the course description. They're fantastic, they're phenomenal. It's just an amazing class of bird species. And today I want to tell you a little bit about four of them, and then we'll look into Cornell and try to look at some birds that we hope to see when we visit the Bombay Hook and the coast of Delaware Bay on Monday. Weather right now sounds a little bit cloudy, maybe a little shower or two. It doesn't sound like any kind of a washout, so I think everything's going to be okay. Amazing shorebirds. Hey, it actually works. I have this new transition that I got from PowerPoint. I'm going to take some liberty here and, if you will, go to a couple of websites and use some of their information that I didn't all necessarily completely compile myself. This one is maintained by the Manomet Bird Observatory, which is up on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And they put together a nice presentation they call Whimbrels on the Wing. And this is just some selections from that sort of thing. The whimbrel is a large shorebird. It runs about, well, a robin's 10 inches, so you can see it's getting up to almost twice the size of a robin with a 32-inch wingspan and weighs almost 14 ounces, so almost a pound. Nice bird. Whimbrel is a kind of curlew. It has a curved bill that's down curved, and the whimbrels typically have eye stripes that you can see here. Very handsome bird, kind of plain overall in the plumage, but still handsome in terms of its stature. And the Manomet Bird Observatory folks have been working with radio transmitters on whimbrels and to be able to follow their location. So this is fairly recent research. I want to take you first to a place on the mid-Atlantic coast called the Georgia Bight, B-I-G-H-T. It's an interesting area in that the way the Gulf Stream goes offshore, there's a countercurrent that runs alongshore north to south. And that causes water in that particular area to build up a bit. The result is that while the tides in Miami and north of North Carolina range a couple of feet at most, high to low tide, the Georgia Bight, on the other hand, it's 6 to 10 feet, which is a pretty high tide rate when you think about it. And it turns out birds have figured out that that's a useful sort of thing. Here's the barrier islands along the Georgia coast. Maybe you recognize some of the names, such as Jekyll Island, Sapelo, and if you're a marine biologist like I used to be, Skidaway Island, which is a very good marine lab, and a number of others. Many of them have been colonized by condors as well as birds. But nevertheless, those are familiar names, and we're interested in particular in the Simons Island area down in the southern part of the Bight. With this, this is sort of an aerial view of the Simons Island region. And you can't really appreciate the tide range until you look at this slide, which shows at low tide how much of the coast is exposed with the low water somewhere between 5 to 10 feet below the normal mean high water level. So huge mudflats, huge extensive mudflats are exposed by this tidal range in the Georgia Bight. Let's see if I had it. I used to have a number here, but that's not important. I can't read all these paraphernalia that goes along with these slides. But it's a few thousands of acres of beaches exposed. And that exposure also exposes things that live within them, particularly fiddler crabs, small crustaceans, smaller than crabs, also various shellfish, small clams, and so on. It's a real bounty for a fairly large shorebird to be able to pick through. And the result is whimbrels, in fact, take great advantage of this to tank up on their way north in particular.
It looks like he's hurting them.
Yeah, it almost does, doesn't it? These are fiddler crabs. See the great big claw on them? That's called the fiddler claw, if you will. The crab itself is an inch or two in size, depending on the species. And, but they are basically a delicatessen for birds that are found there. And in this case, we're looking at whimbrels that are using this to stage to go north. So they're feasting here to fatten up for a long journey that they're going to make to their breeding grounds. This is a whimbrel that was banded back in, trying to see, 2012. And this particular whimbrel was given the name Postal eventually. And it was banded there in the spring of 2012 by a couple of researchers from Manomet. And about 2 weeks after it was banded, the bird flew off. This is not that bird leaving, they didn't catch that, but this is simply the release of the not banded, the tagged bird. This is radio tagged. And it's on its way to fly to just a southern part of Ontario, about 2,000 miles away, essentially nonstop, where it fed again and then flew again to its breeding grounds, which are just on the southwest side of Hudson Bay. And that's where the bird actually bred. During this time, the male and the female make a nest. They take turns in this particular species. They take turns incubating the eggs. And the young eventually hatch, all within a period of less than 2 months. That's all they stay up there. It's only a few weeks after they arrive that they actually lay eggs and start to breed young. I don't have an advance here on my computer, so I'm trying very hard to read the screen up there.
And the nest is.
It's mainly just a depression, okay, in the ground. Not a lot of sticks, not the kind of nest you see with a robin or something like that. It's on the ground. And what the birds are doing, remember when I talked about migration, it's a consensus that birds are migrating in part to take advantage of the high productivity and long day lengths of the northern hemisphere or the far southern hemisphere if it's the austral summer. Take advantage of that. Well, the Arctic tundra does that in spades. There's almost no night. Tremendous insect populations and mosquitoes. Anyone who's doing work up there knows what I'm talking about. Lots of food. And I'm going to teach Peggy a new word. She's learned dihedral pretty well. How about this one? Precocial. Okay. Most shorebird young, and this is true for other species as well, but most shorebird young are precocial. It means simply that as soon as they hatch, within a few hours, they're able to stand up and walk around and actually feed themselves. So they're not dependent on the parents at all for food. There are some precocial shorebirds that are exceptions to that, where the adults do feed the young for a while. But for the most part, the young are basically pre-programmed to harvest the tremendous productivity of the Arctic tundra.
Can they fly?
Not yet. So they run around. If you ever see a young killdeer,
yeah.
You ever seen them run around, right? Seldom fly away, but they run like mad, get away from you. That's a precocial bird. Okay, and it is a shorebird. The young of most of our songbirds are attritial, meaning they are highly dependent on the parents. Once the eggs hatch, the parents feed them, like young robins and so on. You see a lot of nest visits going on, just starting now. But even after the young fledge and leave the nest, the parents are sometimes found feeding the young, so that becomes a fairly visible kind of activity. Precocial birds don't do that. They abandon their young. So within 2 months of arriving, the whimbrels leave and the young are left behind. And when the whimbrels leave, they go back to a staging area, usually on the eastern shore of Virginia, and then they may migrate a little bit further back to the islands of Georgia.
So how do the young learn where to go in the future?
It's like monarchs. They're pre-programmed to at least
Go the
navigate in the right general
Do
direction.
they wait then until the next season?
Nope. They have to leave because the Arctic winter, there's nothing there.
Yeah.
They have to go, but they leave later than the parents because the parents can fly, they're fully fledged, they may molt a bit, but the young still have to develop their flight feathers. So they delay. And that's true for lots of shorebirds. So if you're doing bird watching in the fall, the shorebird migration actually begins as early as late July here in this part of the world. And those are the adults coming back from the breeding grounds. Some of them are still fairly well colored with worn but still recognizable breeding plumage. In September and later, we begin to get the influx of the young ones. And they are in a much less gaudy plumage, the so-called basic plumage, that is not necessarily, it makes them much harder to identify. The parents then also go through a molt, and so they are really, shorebirds in the fall are a real challenge to identify because you're dealing with worn adults followed by molted adults, followed by young of the year coming in later on. But the adults come first.
Is there any data on attrition for precocial birds?
Sure, and it's substantial. Migration is a risk, and especially with young birds that may not be that familiar with where they're going and what they're feeding. Yes, there is. In terms of real data, I'm not familiar with it, so I'll just have to say I'm sure that it exists, but it's not well known. A lot of such data, though, have only become known since we've been able to put radio transmitters on birds. Banding doesn't help very much. Once in a while you find a dead bird somewhere and it's banded, you can call it in.
Are they
But
banning them?
They don't have that much information. They're starting to because they're getting transmitters good enough to be able to do that.
I would have
But
been
it's still
curious.
recent.
Yeah, I would have been curious how many are lost to predators before they could fly away.
Exactly. And I'd have to say, I don't know that literature, but it's got to be fairly recent.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, what happens is that these birds then wind up, they go to South Carolina, maybe part of the Georgia area, but eventually, according to this bird that was radio transmitted, Postal, he went on to the mud flats in the Brazilian coast, northern Brazilian coast, where there is a tremendous, not the tide range we had in Georgia, but a lot of exposed mud flats at certain times of the year, particularly in our winter time, and they're able to feed there. It's not as abundant of food as there was in the Georgia Bight, but it's enough to get them through the winter. So they don't have to tank up and get all ready for long migration. They just need to sustain themselves. And this is one of the areas they do that. And then Postal, who was followed for almost 3.5 years, the transmitter lasted that long before it failed, they found that Postal came back to where he was banded, very close to the same area, back to St. Stephen's Island in the Georgia Bight, to begin another flight north as well. Here's a rare picture. It actually shows Postal that someone actually caught by taking photographs. They weren't really looking for the bird because they don't have, this particular transmitter doesn't transmit directly to a receiver like a phone. It transmits to a network. So, but they were actually able to take pictures, and Postal's in the middle there. And you can see the transmitting antenna sticking out his back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Very unusual and very rare kind of sight to be able to see.
How do they keep that from interference with his wings?
It's strapped to the belly and under the wings, and so it apparently does not interfere with the being able to fly. It's a tight fit. But they're able to.
Really annoying.
Yeah, isn't that incredible? Yeah. So there he is. Actually taken a picture taken in the Georgia Bight of this particular bird. As I say, the transmitter failed after about 3.5 years, but they were able therefore to get a couple of flights up and a couple of flights back. And what they found out was that Postal had tremendous sight affinity. When it left the Georgia Bight, it would go back to the same staging grounds in the Great Lakes area that it had done in years previous, and it went back to near the same place in the same breeding grounds on the Arctic tundra. And in the fall, it came back to the same area around the eastern shore of Virginia or North Carolina, and then it went to the same region in Brazil. Tremendous sight affinity for these species. They don't just, it's not a random walk. They actually go to specific places. But there's more to that amazing sort of thing. They're going to the place that's the most productive when they need it the most. When the bird goes to the Georgia Bight on spring migration, it needs those fiddler crabs to tank up, to gain weight, which sometimes doubles, before it makes the long flight.
I wonder how
When it-
many of them you can eat in a day.
That beats me, but it must be a lot. And when it comes back to those areas, it tanks up again to make the long couple of 1,000-mile flight to Brazil. There are actually 3 populations of whimbrel in North America, and Manomet has studied all 3 of them and found the same general idea. That is that the birds have site affinity, they go to the same staging areas in spring and fall, and breed in the same region of the northern tundra in the summertime. And their wintering grounds vary. Postal went to Brazil, some go to coastal Argentina, but nonetheless, the ones that have been tagged and followed show the same general pattern of affinity of sites. This is also useful because it's not only amazing in terms of the shorebird's timing, its affinity for where it goes, the ability to harvest the northern productivity and the productivity of specific parts of this country when they need it most, but also it links people together. And so we have now colleagues from Manomet and also in Brazil and elsewhere actually working on the same projects to maintain and preserve bird habitat as a global kind of effort. It's connecting not only individual birds with communities, but individual people with communities as well. And that's a fantastic lesson to have a bird like that show us. And most of that information has only been available since about 2012. Postal. Let's try another one. This one is not one we're going to see because it's a Pacific coast bird, but it's been in the news enough that it's worth seeing. This is the bar-tailed godwit. We do have godwits, and maybe we'll see them when we go to Bombay Hook on Monday. We have the marbled godwit over here. On the whole, godwits are kind of rosy underneath, but unlike the curlew with the down-curved bill, these bills curve up a little bit, and it's quite noticeable in most cases. The bar-tailed is a big bird. Its length is almost a yard, 36 inches, with a 30-inch wingspan and a weight of 12 ounces, something like that, getting up again to a pound. A bird with capable of putting on some weight when it has to. When the bar-tailed, where I'm going here, in 1976, there was a researcher named Robert Gill, related to Douglas Gill, who worked at Chino Farms up at Chestertown for some time. Gill was conducting a bird survey on the south coast of Alaska, where bar-tailed godwits are known to stage prior to leaving after their summer breeding. And he was struck by the fact that the bar-tailed godwits looked really fat. In his opinion, they looked kind of like flying softballs, maybe even bigger than that. And Gill knows his birds, so I mean, that's have an ornithologist make extreme comments like that is itself interesting. It was known from banding studies that bar-tailed godwits wintered in New Zealand. You know, we're talking about he was in Alaska, right? It was known they wintered in New Zealand and Australia, but it was surmised that in fact they used the Western Pacific coast, Japan, Korea, and on down, to basically sort of hopscotch down the Western Pacific to get to New Zealand. That's still a long way, but those flights did not necessarily have to be very long. The problem is we didn't know that for sure. That was just a surmise. It was not until 30 years after his first observations in 76, not until 2006, that Gill was able to apply technology to the problem. They were able to implant, in this case, put inside the bird, implant them under the skin, satellite transmitters to several bar-tailed godwits and track their actual flight. He found that when they left Alaska, which they often time to do just after the passage of a Pacific storm, which give them a tailwind, when they left Alaska, they headed out to sea. They didn't fly along the Bering Strait, didn't fly down the Pacific coast. They headed out to sea and stayed out over the Pacific, according to the transmitter. One of the ones they put a transmitter on arrived in New Zealand 9 days after it left Alaska. That's a distance of 7,100 miles. It's the longest non-stop flight ever recorded. Godwits do not have web feet. They cannot land on the water, and if they did, they couldn't take off again. It had to be nonstop. 9 days, 7,100 miles. Gill noticed that the birds were incredibly fat. And let's look at there's the route. This is the fall migration on your right, leaving Alaska, flying out over the Pacific in September, and arriving in New Zealand in September as well. Feeding down there and staying put until March, then leaving, going up Australia and up the Western Pacific. We used to think was the way it headed south, but now in fact we know it's the way it heads north. Gill did some physiology and published a paper on some other adaptations. They found that the Godwits elevated their metabolic rate 8 to 10 times above their basal rate. If you're a Tour de France bicyclist, the best you can do is 5 times increasing your metabolic rate, interspersed with nights long sleeps. This Godwit flew 9 days without sleeping, at least not landing to sleep. During the fueling phase of their migration, that is while they're still in Alaska, the intestines and the liver greatly enlarge so as to be able to metabolize food and to store it into fat and muscles, which is why the bird looked so big to Gill when he first saw them. The breast muscles in particular get a lot of fat, a lot of fuel and get huge enlargements so that they can make that long flight. When they leave and start to fly, they found that the liver and intestines actually shrink by at least a quarter. And the protein that's released in there is also used to fuel the flight muscles and so on. In other words, their unessential organs shrink. The bird can't feed while it's flying over the Pacific. It has no way of doing that. It's interesting that that the long flight in the fall, where they really tank up in coastal Alaska, get all that fat on board, take off according to decent weather, and wind up in New Zealand if they're lucky. In fact, that's fine, but when the birds are going back, they do land high. And they do that in part because it's an adaptation. They're going to spend a lot of energy in breeding up in Alaska when they get there. And so basically, they hop along the coast in order to be able to continue to feed and to store energy so that when they arrive in Alaska, they're not totally emaciated. When they arrive in New Zealand in the fall, they're a mess.
Why do they not go back the same way they came?
And it's a matter of getting more food. If they flew from New Zealand to Alaska straight away, they would arrive in Alaska so emaciated and so energy starved, and also with organs that have shrunk and everything else, including the gonads, that they wouldn't be able to breathe.
I was thinking the other way around.
Uh-huh.
Why don't they go or come back along the coastal?
Yeah, it's surmised that they do that in part because there's very little predation when they're flying out over the Pacific. There are no predators around to interfere with them. And for that matter, they're also, in a sense, somewhat isolated, so it's less likely they're going to get diseases.
So that
And
means,
so there are adaptations that make that profitable for them.
so in September, there's more predation than there is in March through.
Yeah, there could be. Yeah, there could be.
And so,
That's not proven, it's surmised.
and they're heading down to New Zealand just to.
That's their wintering ground. And of course, that's our winter, New Zealand summer, so it's very productive there. And they're able to maintain their population in the wintering grounds there. And then come March or so, they start to head north, but they do it in spurts instead of continuously.
So they go all the way down there and then they head back up to breed.
Right. So, and this is true for a lot of other shorebirds as well. The longest flights are in the wintertime. That is when they leave to head south. Those are when they do the least feeding. They tank up at the north and then they head south. When they come back up, they often go along land routes and other such things, so they can maintain a reasonable amount of energy so that they'll have enough of breeding grounds. Yeah,
Amazing trip.
yeah. Isn't it amazing?
Yeah, yeah.
And a lot of this was not known more than a couple of decades ago.
Huh.
Wow. Okay. This one's a little more standard. This is the semi-palmated sandpiper. We're going to see it in droves when we go to Bombay Hook. A fairly plain-looking sparrow-sized sandpiper. 6 inches long, only weighs, doesn't even weigh an ounce. But there's lots of them along the coast of North America and also in the Mississippi Valley and elsewhere during migration.
So cute.
Yeah, they're cute little guys. And we'll look at how to identify them a bit. Here's a sort of summary of it. And again, I have to be a little careful because I can't see it on my screen here. I have to read it off of there. But basically, they breed in the Arctic tundra. That's the green. All right. And in the fall, they migrate south. All the yellow there is migrant passages. So over most of our part of the world, in North America and a good deal of Canada, they are simply passage birds. They migrate through. Before they leave, the adults and the young may double their weight, and so they get enough energy to be able to fly long distances. And at least on the Atlantic coast, the semi-palmated sandpiper stages along the coast and then flies out over the ocean to northern South America, which is where it winters. So that long flight, they're able to use coastal productivity, in this case, after the breeding season, to tank up, if you will, to make the long flight over the Atlantic to the Caribbean and then to northern Brazil, and where they actually spend the winter. In the springtime, kind of resembles the godwits in that they tend to then fly over land back to the tundra, also along the coast. That's what we're going to see. So they harvest the productivity of the coast and the productivity of the spring growth in the inland to stepping stone up to the Arctic tundra. So the overall pattern is still the same. Long flight in the fall, shorter flights in the spring, so that they don't use all their energy and have enough left to do breeding when they get up north. And the displays of these birds, I've seen them actually displaying in northern Alaska on one trip up there, and it's really incredible. We won't see it here, so there's no use trying to play it for you. You would want to go back.
They're there.
They hoot, howl, and they get up in the air and they hover and they do all kinds of stuff. Huge energy waste, but in order to signify their territories and to take care of it. And their young are precocial. All right. Here's a summary of Magdalene Run. See if I can get it. I'm given the circumstances here, I won't try to stop it. But here we go. We're looking at the week of the year on the left. On the right, you see it moving up to the center of America and then down in the wintertime to South America. You can barely see the band in South America where they're wintering on the coast of northern Brazil. Okay, you can barely see it. If it runs again, watch the Atlantic coast now. You'll see it darken when the birds show up. This time of year, see it, Chesapeake Bay, and then it darkens again in the fall. These are actually very abundant at those times of year. And again, it's using that particular habitat to enable to toke up, if you will, or to store up energy in the fall for the trip to South America, and the spring heading back to the tundra. Okay?
Just semi-palm.
Semi-palmated sandpiper. They have some little tiny webs between their toes.
Okay.
Okay, let's move on here. Here's our poster piece, if you will. The red knot. Sometimes used to be called the robin snipe because of its nice red color. And there was a time when the red knots were fairly abundant. Not anymore. This is a bird, a robin is 10 inches long. This is like a fat little robin with a big bill. Wingspan of almost 2 feet, weighs 4.7 ounces. So it's a medium-sized to largish shorebird. Pretty handsome thing. This is in the breeding plumage. This is the bird that really requires, if you will, specific areas in which to stage for migration. Our species of red knot, our subspecies, I should say, is called rufa, R-U-F-A. So it's the scientific name with the addition term rufa. Rufa red knots breed in northern Canada, and they winter, for the most part, in Tierra del Fuego, southern Argentina. So here you see the breeding range up in the north that's yellow. And in blue, you see some wintering ranges in northern South America, but the ones that come along the Atlantic coast in particular go down to as far as Tierra del Fuego in southern Argentina. It's a heck of a long journey. There was a bird banded in 1995 with a red flag. It had a red flag on one leg and a black band on the other leg. The flag was labeled B95. This is a bird banding study. And it was known that this bird was seen both in the Arctic breeding grounds and in Tierra del Fuego. That's about 10,000 miles, if you will, between the two. It was last seen, B95, the bird banded B95, was last seen in New Jersey and then on its Arctic breeding grounds in 2014. At that point, the age was 19 years. Most Rufa red knots don't live that long. They live about 5 years based on other banding studies. But it was figured that during this time between 1995 and 2014, given that where it wintered and where it summered, it flew further than the distance to the moon, maybe half again as much. And so the bird was nicknamed Moonbird. And it became famous. There was actually a biography about it. Here's kind of Moonbird's 18,000-mile journey from its Arctic breeding grounds down to Tierra del Fuego and back again. The long leg, which is the longest red leg on the right, is the long flight it makes, which is again typical of many shorebirds. They fly the longest distances in the fall because they don't have to arrive and breed. And then it does some hopping on somewhat shorter legs, if you call those short, heading back to their breeding grounds, stopping once or twice at least on the way. Okay,
So Wayne,
go ahead.
when they leave do they leave in a big group? And who runs the group? Who's the tour guide?
Probably we don't know that much about that kind of behavior since we're really following individual birds. There may be some groups, but they do arrive kind of build up in groups. And one of the most important staging areas for that bird heading north is right here, Delaware Bay.
Where?
Delaware Bay.
Will you see them?
Okay, and that's where we hope to see them on Monday, or at least see some of them. Why Delaware Bay? Why not Chesapeake Bay? Why not Long Island Sound? It has to do with horseshoe crabs. In middle of May, when these birds arrive, the horseshoe crab is breeding. And the horseshoe crabs lay millions and millions of tiny little green eggs that they come ashore at the edge of the tide, often with with a full moon in May. They mate, they lay the eggs, and guess who gets to eat the banquet? So the red knots have adopted a strategy that makes Delaware Bay an incredibly important stopover. Remove the horseshoe crabs in some way or another, and in fact, remove that important stopover point. And that's really important for their refueling in order to get up to the Arctic. So horseshoe crabs of late have been harvested and over-harvested, in part by watermen for conch and eel bait, but also it turns out that the bluish blood of horseshoe crab is extremely sensitive to gram-negative bacteria infections, and it's used to check the sterility of medical equipment. And so the blood is also harvested for that purpose alone. The blood can be extracted from the crabs, but it's not entirely without some mortality. So there's still, that harvest still goes on. There is now an artificial alternative to horseshoe crab blood, but it's expensive and that isn't necessarily quite as sensitive as the real thing. So there still is medical harvesting that goes on. All of those harvests, which remove horseshoe crabs from the environment, basically are threatening the red knot populations. Let's see if I had some numbers here. Let's see if I put them down here. Okay. Populations of red knot, spring of 2021, the populations in Delaware Bay of red knot coming up, remember, on their way north, reached an all-time low. Fewer than 7,000 birds were counted many of them, the Mispillion DuPont Nature Center, which we may visit on Monday. That's about a third of what appeared in 2020, the previous year, and less than the 90,000 that used to occur there in the early 1990s. Population is really taking a slug in this particular case. Delaware Bay is the single most important stopover point for red knots in their northward migration. So there's Moonbird. There was a book written about it, published in 2012. And if we do visit Mispillion, you'll see this statue of the red knot at the DuPont Nature Center. It's still there. I was there the other day, and it's still there. And you'll notice the note on the side there by the leg, B95. That's Moonbird's likeness, if you will. What that phenomenon looks like is something like this. It's hard to find the knots in here because these pictures are more recent than they were in the 1990s. Let's see if I can. There is one right by the pointer. You can see the reddish color. There are a couple of them in there. There's one up here, almost out of view. That's a red knot there. The rest of these birds that are also taking advantage of the horseshoe crab egg laying, and there are all the crabs, males and females. The males are smaller and tacked onto the back of the females. The eggs are green, and there actually is an environmental education program about this phenomenon called Green Eggs in Sand that many nature centers have adopted. There are other species that take advantage of this as well. There's enough eggs to go around, but Dunlin and semi-palmated sandpiper, for that matter, ruddy turnstones, and laughing gulls also catch in on the harvest. And I don't know whether we'll see anything quite this phenomenon, but I do hope we'll have a chance to at least see what's going on when we visit the coast there. You won't see this at Bombay Hook. That's a little too far inland. So we're going to take a detour to the coast after we do Bombay Hook and try to check out this phenomenon after lunch on Monday. And we'll see what we can do. I'm going to try to scout it to see where our best prospects are for at least seeing a horseshoe crab phenomenon, and with a little of maybe some red knots as well. It's amazing, isn't it? These are amazing birds. The timing of this, the importance of the connection, the importance of the staging areas, everything about shorebirds is really geared for being able to arrive at the right time, at the right place, in the right physiological condition. They don't have the alternatives of being able to, like songbirds, go to another oak tree. I want to keep that slide back. Yeah, that'll do. The previous slide was a paper. Yeah, this is a paper that appeared in 2019 in Science. Many of you heard me talk, know a little bit about this. This is the one that documents using bird data, radar data, Christmas bird counts, breeding bird survey, all of the data over the past roughly 50 years, and has documented that the numbers of individuals of birds, not species, numbers of individuals of birds has declined by about a third in North America over the past 50 years. Those declines are across the board. It's made rarer species rarer, more abundant species less abundant, and so on. But that is a serious documentation of a change in our North American avifauna. And when you look at which ones have declined the most, all the way on the right, 50% of the populations of shorebirds have declined in the last 50 years. The only real gains have been ones we talked about in our first class back in January or February. The wetland birds, ducks, thanks to the prairie pothole restorations and other such things, our wetland birds have actually gained a bit in population, although they were down before then. But for everything else, bird populations have declined, and most hard hit are birds of early successional habitats like grasslands and scrub and the shorebirds. So they are fantastic, but they're rapidly fading from the scene. And I'm hoping that we'll come up with reasonable environmental policies that will preserve not only the breeding grounds in the tundra, but also what's really important to them is the staging areas that they return to with great site fidelity year after year after year.
Are they thinking that the loss of that habitat or the breeding grounds is what's causing some of this?
It's not the breeding grounds.
Or the
It's the
feeding, staging, yeah, okay.
If we can keep the oil companies from messing up the Arctic tundra, that would be great. But we'll make a bigger difference now if we can protect those coastal staging. And where's a lot of development going on the coast, where do most people live? Within an hour or two of the coast.
What about those windmills they talk about putting in along the coast?
They're offshore.
Or they're far enough offshore, it
Yeah,
doesn't matter.
I'd be less worried about those than I would the loss of the habitat where the crabs are.
I've felt like over the years, because we used to go down to Ocean City, Maryland every summer.
Mhm.
And when my children were small, there were lots of those little birds going around. And now you see them, but you almost don't see them.
Yeah, that's right.
And that explains that.
That's partially an explanation. There's some other things, but that's partially. When you've got 50% of the population that have gone down for 50 years, that's our lifetime. You know the difference.
Good, great.
You can see the difference. So, yes, they're amazing, but they're amazing for lots of reasons, and they're also incredibly threatening. That ends the PowerPoint part, so now I can go to Cornell, and we can look at some identification. Anybody have any questions about that?
With these little horseshoe crabs that they're putting in at Poplar Island, I wonder if ever there would be enough to attract a bunch of red knots to come there.
It wouldn't hurt. It wouldn't hurt. There are birds that have come to Poplar Island because of the habitat restoration, such as the blackneck stilt. I don't really have avocets breeding there now or not, but there have been a couple of birds that were not breeding in Maryland before Poplar
That
Island
have showed up.
that now have showed up. So build them habitat and they may come.
I think if you type in Cornell ornithology,
Okay, well, let's try, how about, let's even try better now. All about birds.
it's right there.
Okay, show up.
Yeah.
Okay, just hit enter, I guess. Okay.
Parakeet.
Yeah, that's, I don't know,
No.
I want the site. All right, well, let's try Cornell instead. Even,
Oh, there it is.
there it is. Well, there, well, that works Cornell, that probably do it. Bird guide search. There we go. Okay, get my cheat sheet here is walk through that. Okay, so you agree, these guys are amazing.
Yes.
These guys are amazing. All right, let's go look at some of them.
Peggy, are you able to see his shared screen? Okay, good.
Good. Okay, you guys have any questions? Got the point? Okay, we'll hammer it home on Monday as well. Let's start, we're going to start with a group of shorebirds called plovers, Plovers. And the representative one that you're very familiar with is this one. This one is amazing, but not in the same way that the other ones were. Tends to be a resident around here. Killdeer, all plovers are easy to tell, not necessarily apart, but you can separate a plover from a sandpiper by the fact that they have this habit of walking and stopping when they feed. Walk and stop, walk and stop, walk and stop. Maybe peck, but walk and stop. They don't peck as they walk. And that behavior makes it fairly easy to tell a plover from a sandpiper. Killdeer are plovers that have two breast bands. The bird is robin sized. Most of you are familiar with the noise. Let's see if it plays all right for us. That's its name. Okay, and some of you may be fortunate enough to have them breeding in your driveway or nesting in your driveway. All right. Nesting in your driveway. Some of us, when that happens, put a road cone up or something to protect the nest. There isn't much to the nest. It's just a little scrape of a few rocks. The young are precocial. Shortly after they hatch, the young can run off and the nest will be abandoned and you can remove the road comb if you so desire. The range of the killdeer, we get a few in the winter, that's the purple. The breeding range is red and purple, and they winter somewhat in Central America. Those don't stick around here. So you can see them all year. We usually get a few on the Christmas bird count, but they're less common. But that is a plover, it is a shorebird, and many plovers are not just coastal, they'll often be inland so that you can see them in your fields around here, or even in the middle of the country. That's the killdeer. And I think most of you are pretty familiar with it. Can I close it? I need to get up to the search bar. And see
If
if
you
I
go
can-
to the other search bar.
Yeah.
Oh, no, wait,
It's usually up there.
you can move
Does
that.
that move?
Yeah, I think you can move it.
There we go. All right,
Yeah.
whatever it is.
It's, you know what it is? It's the Zoom.
Okay. All right, so now we'll search for another plover here. This one resembles a killdeer, but it's a lot smaller. Oopsie. Yeah. It's a long reach here. All right.
Oh,
We talked about semi-palmated sandpiper. There's also a semi-palmated plover. They don't look alike, although the size is about the same. This is actually a little guy. This is a little bit bigger than a sparrow, like sort of about the size of maybe one of your white-throated sparrows. Longer legs. Yeah, if that'll stay out of the way, that's cool. As long as I can get that search bit there. Unlike the killdeer, in addition to its size, it has only one breastband. So when you see a small bird, walk, stop, maybe peck, walk, stop, it's probably this one because it's a bit more, it's fairly common. It likes the coast a bit more, but you will find it in mud flats along the edge of the fields as well. It is passing through here. Yellow is migration. A few winter in the Chesapeake region, most winter further south, and it breeds on the tundra. So when we do see them, they're on their way north to take advantage of that northern productivity we've talked about. We should see several, if not more than that, at Bombay Hook. And again, you know it right away by the single breastband, the white breast, and the plover behavior. Semi-palmated plover.
and you'll be smaller.
And yes, about half the size of the killdeer. All right? This one is we're all concerned about. We probably won't see it, but I'm going to put it up there just in case, because the beaches get closed toward the end of May to protect the species here. It's somewhat endangered. This is the piping plover. It's about the same size as a semi-palmated, maybe a bit smaller. And cute little precocial young here. But it's very much lighter in color than the semi-palmated, and the breastband, while it may show up in the breeding adult like this, the bird is so light above that you probably won't have any trouble misidentifying it. It's rare. We close the beaches on Massachusetts Island, Cape Henlopen State Park in Delaware and elsewhere. These birds nest on the sandy beaches, and we're trying to protect them from being exposed. Here on the Atlantic coast, this is their breeding range. There is a population that breeds in the center of the country, not in the tundra. In this case, it's much more of a beach bird, and then winters along the southern Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast as well. This is the piping plover. It would be wonderful if we could see one, not likely. But nonetheless, it's well known, so I thought I'd put it up there. The other plover that we're likely to see is this one. Hyphen.
He's down too.
Yeah. There we go. This is killdeer sized. It's actually a little bigger. It's our largest plover and very handsome when it's in breeding plumage. We do get it in the winter at Ocean City, in particular. At this point, it loses all that wonderful color, but it has a black belly. The black does not extend further than the vent, so that under the tail, it's quite white. It's usually speckled black and white above, and has a lovely song or call that sometimes announces its presence. And if we're lucky, we'll hear that, and I'll be able to say there's a black-bellied plover around here somewhere. They sometimes occur in groups, but even in the winter, it will sometimes give that call. It's very much a coastal bird. You will see it inland along the Delmarva Peninsula, including some old fields here. Once in a while, we get them here in Easton. But for the most part, it hugs the coast and winters along the Atlantic coast and the Gulf Coast and Pacific Coast population. But it'll be leaving and doing, look where it breeds, way the heck up in the Arctic tundra. Almost nothing in between, not even around Hudson Bay. Scroll down here. There is another bird that's similar to it, which is a little bit more likely to be seen in fields. It's slightly more upland than the black-bellied plover. It looks a lot like it. Here's the black-belly, and this is the golden plover, the American golden plover. This bird is really very handsome. It tends to have a dark cap, which the black-belly lacks. It also has golden specks on the back. They don't show up well in this particular picture. But otherwise, they look a lot alike. But the black on the belly goes all the way under the tail, and usually you can see that. But if you can't, if the bird takes flight, the golden plover has white under the wings, and the black belly has dirty armpits, black armpits. And that shows up pretty well if you can get close enough to see the bird. So this is a bird you're more likely to see in fields. They do pass through here. We get them up on the sod farms north of town on John Brown Road up near Centerville on occasion, whereas black-bellied we're much more likely to see on the immediate coast or on fields within that area. I'd be surprised if we don't see black-bellies at Bombay Hook. I would be somewhat surprised if we saw golden plovers there, but it is possible. There are some there. So eBird tells me. Those are the plovers. Again, you can get plovers separated from sandpipers right away, which cuts down to only 5 species at most if you watch the behavior. Walk and stop, walk and stop, walk and stop, occasionally stopping and picking at food, but not picking as it goes. That's a very strong, very good plover type behavior.
And you said the whimbrel is a plover as
The
well.
wimbler is not a plover. It's basically just a large plover. It's not a plover. That's right. Good question. Yep. All right. Okay, we'll look again at whimbrel for a minute shortly. Let's now go to the larger, if you will, the larger sandpipers or larger shorebirds that are not plovers. We'll begin with one we saw when we went to Ocean City. Let's just try this. Yeah. Those of you who went to Ocean City on our Special Birds and Special Places trip in midwinter saw this guy.
Oh,
Yeah. American oyster catcher, large bird, bigger than a robin, noisy when it was calling. It wasn't doing much of that. Call is quite good. It's not a plover. It will peck as it walks, and it's got that huge, lovely orange bill, and otherwise a black and white plumage. A big black and white bird with a big orange bill is an American oyster catcher. Nothing else like it. We may see it at, we're more likely to see it if we get to Mispillion or go along the coast, on the immediate coast. It prefers the immediate coast as opposed to inland. So it's less likely to show up in fields. We saw it at Ocean City on some of the sand bars behind the barrier island, behind Ocean City. And we also saw it on the jetty.
Yeah, that's where I've seen it.
That must be a really strong beak.
It is. It is. I wouldn't say they necessarily catch oysters, but they certainly can pick up crabs and other types of fish, shellfish, fairly well.
But it reminds me of oysters.
Yes, exactly. All right, let's try this one. This is special for us here. Yeah. You won't have any problem identifying this if we see it, and there, interestingly enough, there is a colony at Bombay Hook. It's really a western species for the most part, but along the Chesapeake and Delaware Bays, there is a colony. If you look at some bird books, field guides, they don't even show it there. But they're there, and sometimes you'll see 40 or 50 of them at Bombay Hook. This is the American avocet, and it, in breeding plumage, has this lovely light orange coloration, but the obvious thing about it is the bill is upturned. Reminds you of a godwit, but it's much more strongly upturned, particularly at the end. And it's a much finer bill than godwits have. The bird's overall plumage, other than the rust, is orange, is black and white. In the winter, it's almost all black and white. You don't see a lot of the rusty tinge there. And when you look at the map, it's fairly common in the western parts of the United States. And then we have this little teeny breeding population right here in Delaware Bay, in particular Bombay Hook. And that population also winters on the southern parts of the East Coast.
So it looks like it eats the same thing as the other birds. How come the bill has adapted that way?
Let's see, is this one show it? Watch the behavior.
Just gonna scoop.
Yeah, it started. It doesn't probe into the mud. It swishes the bill back and forth and picks up small plankton that's swimming in the water itself, or might have been kicked up from the mud.
And it
which
doesn't
is the way it
stop.
walks around.
Yeah.
It doesn't walk and stop. That's right. It's not a plover. And if we're lucky, we'll see that behavior at Bombay Hook. But it's a swish side thing. The other bird that does a lot of that is the flamingo, much bigger bird. Nonetheless, that's the kind of behavior that you'll see there. Sliding that curved beak back and forth, not probing it down into the mud. American avocet. Okay? That bird again is bigger, is larger than the mud. So it's a good size. All right, there's another bird about that same size. That is beginning to show up on Poplar Island. So if you visit there, you may see them in the breeding season. But if you don't, they do breed at Bombay Hook, and the chances are fairly good we'll see a couple of them at least. This is the black-necked stilt. Body size is the size of a robin. Leg size, it's the size of, I don't know, it's a stilt. It's well named. And not only are the legs long, they're bubblegum colored.
And what?
So bubblegum colored. Big, pink, long legs. When the bird flies, the legs trail way out behind it. Otherwise, a big black and white bird with a straight, thin bill. Likes marshes and marsh grasses. That's a good picture showing it there. Wintertime, a little bit plainer, but nevertheless, this black and white pattern, and always bubblegum legs, long, tall bubblegum legs. Several years ago, I was with the youth birders, and we were doing a field trip. We go to Bombay Hook usually in early August for our first trip of the year. And the stilts had just, the young were still there. They're less precocial than they are than other shorebirds. The parents were still around there. And you see these tiny little tall, long-legged things huddling under the mother who's still trying to settle down and hide them, by collapsing her feet. It's really a cute kind of sight to see. And they make a slight nest in the marsh edges. They like the grasses, so that sometimes they're hard to tease out of there, but almost always we can see them, and they should be there now.
Can we see the little video?
We won't see the little guys. They probably won't show
I
up
meant the
until
video
July.
at the end.
Pardon?
Can you do the video at the bottom? Or,
Oh, that one right there.
Yeah.
Don't.
they don't,
This one here?
yeah,
Yeah,
just interesting to see.
let's see. I don't think there's any babies with this one, but
Oh.
who knows? See those long legs?
Look at that.
And see, it doesn't stop. It picks as it goes.
Really?
And look at the picture of it in flight with the legs out.
Yeah, and there you see, the one in flight there, you can see those legs trailing out behind like a super tail, if
Wow.
you will. Neat bird. Black-necked stilt. So some of these birds aren't so hard to identify when you actually think about it, once you learn who they are.
Yeah.
But we'll get some challenges as well. Okay, these are big birds. Here's another larger one, but these can be confusing. We'll take the somewhat more obvious one. There are two birds that are stilt sized and have long legs. They're not as long as a stilt. And they're a little bit heavier overall with a heavier bill. These are called the yellow legs. And there are two species, both occur around here. First of all, they're well named. If the stilt could have been called bubblegum legs, I guess it should have been. But these guys do have bright yellow legs, and unless they're walking around in a lot of mud, that shows up pretty well. And the legs are fairly long. The greater yellow legs is slightly larger than the other one, which is the lesser yellow legs. And I can't always tell them apart. There are some differences in plumage, but they're subtle, and it depends a lot on the wear of the feathers, the time of year, whether the bird has been molting, all of that stuff. And so I don't find plumage as reliable a field mark as it might be. Typical greater yellow legs have a bill longer than the head is wide. That is, longer than the head is from the base of the bill to the back. And it tends to look like it's slightly upturned. In some cases, you have to imagine that, but in most cases, it's never downturned, and it's seldom absent. It may be absolutely straight. There are times when you have to simply say it's a yellow legs
Well, that
species.
top picture of the three, you could see the beak goes up a little bit.
Yeah, here you can see it here,
Yeah.
right? But there are some examples down here when they're comparing species where it's straighter, particularly in the younger birds. Here's a lesser for comparison. On the whole, the lesser's bill is shorter overall. The impression is shorter. These are not to scale, by the way. The lesser looks bigger than it probably should be. And here you can't see the legs, which doesn't help very much. But it tends to be straighter, doesn't have that slight upturn that the greater has. But in many cases, you just have to say, oh, I don't know. Greater is slightly more common and tends to winter around here a little bit. Lesser tends to move out of the area in late winter, in late fall. And but they're almost equally abundant much of the year. And so you just have to look for the typical best looking. This is a breeder, this is a non-breeder, but if you wanted me to describe the plumage and say this is the way they all look, I couldn't do that. So you really have to look at, first, is it the yellow legs? That should be obvious. And they do wade up to their belly and can actually swim. But for the most part, they walk along the shore's edge. And once again, see if there's any hint of an upturn in what looks like a longer bill. That will help you. We get them both at Pickering Creek. They are not just coastal birds. They also occur inland in mudflats, places like that. Okay, they're similar species. So I have to go back. Okay. No. Okay. All righty. Those are the yellowlegs. So it's two species, and I'll do my best to point out the differences between them when we get to Bombay Hook, because the chances are good that we'll see them both. The views of Bombay Hook, I'll have a couple of spotting scopes. In some cases, we're going to need to use the scope to get close enough to actually see the birds. But unlike the Tweety birds that we've been seeing in the trees that flip from leaf to leaf, these guys stay put. And at least you'll have a chance to look at them and to get a representative look at something. One of the less descriptive birds is this one, the willing. Yeah. Up in New Jersey when they do the World Series of birding. This is a Western, but actually let me go back. Yeah. Yeah. Here's the history. Western's a little paler. Fairly nondescript looking bird.
It looks like the other.
It looks a lot like the other one. The bill's a little heavier.
Yeah.
Okay, but the legs aren't yellow. That helps. All right.
And a thicker.
But you won't have a problem when the bird flies.
Oh.
Okay. Huge white wing bars in all plumages. This is actually an immature bird probably. And so you won't have a problem with that. If we go to, they also are quite noisy in breeding season at least. up in New Jersey on the flats up there, they've got about 20 of these things doing that. So pretty obvious. Hillwillow, one boat calls it Hillwillow, I don't know. But anyway, so if you see a really plain bird, the legs aren't yellow and it's fairly large, chances are it's a willet, and usually in time it will fly or be affiliated with a bird that will fly. And as soon as those spectacular wings open up, you won't have a problem. So that's the willet, and they're moving through right now on their way to breeding grounds in coastal New Jersey and north. Very common in the Cape May area and up along Cape Cod and so on. Willet. Okay, those are large birds. We also have some other ones that I've introduced you, at least in part, and this has to do with we did the Whimbrel. I'll just do that one. Okay, we saw the Whimbrel information. This is postal. This is not him, of course, but this is what they look like. They have that stripy head, and all the curlews have downturned bills. This is our most common one on the East Coast. It's not real abundant here, but the chances are fair that we will see it. It's a large shorebird, so if we do see it, you won't have a problem identifying it. There are other curlews around in North America, but the most obvious one is this one, called the long-billed curlew, which we don't have. So here's the Whimbrel. Look at this guy.
Wow.
But he's a western bird. Under the wings is kind of a buffy rust, also a sizable bird. Once in a while, we get a rare one here on the coast, here in the Atlantic coast, but for the most part, it's a western species. Long-billed curlew. There are others, but that's the main one that we'd be interested in. So curlews have down-curved bills, and the other ones, the Godwits, Curlew. Sure. Okay, we'll look at the one we get. The marbled Godwit. Curlews, bill down curve, Godwits, slightly up curve, but obviously up curve. Okay, it's not as strongly up curved as an avocet, but it's a heavier looking bill. In the case of the marbled, it has a lovely two-tone effect here. These use that long bill to probe into the mud, sometimes very deeply. Most shorebirds have very sensitive cells, feelers type cells on the ends of their bill, and actually in some cases the bill can actually move a little bit. So they can actually, when they probe, it's not just random, they actually can sense the nearness of a piece of prey and can adjust to get to it. Fairly tall bird, fairly long. The size actually a little bit bulkier than the yellow legs. Dark legs, slightly upcurved bill. This is the marbled Godwit. There's also a Hudsonian Godwit, which has a facial pattern that's a little closer to that curlew we saw, the Whimbrel. But again, always the upturned bill. They actually winter close to here. You can usually find them at Chincoteague in the wintertime. But they tend to breed pretty far north and pretty far west. So they'll be passing through if we see them at all, leaving their wintering grounds for their breeding grounds in the interior of the country. Interesting area there. That's the prairie potholes. They breed with the ducks. Okay. Okay, those are the large shorebirds. We get to the medium-sized shorebirds. We have this guy, of course, which we've already introduced, old moonbird. And there he is again. Robin, as I said, sometimes called the robin snipe because of its size. It doesn't have the long bill of a snipe, but it's longish for a shorebird. Fairly easy to tell apart in this breeding season, because of its robin red breast. And again, it tends to mix with other shorebirds that are harvesting the horseshoe crabs. We see its distribution here. It just happens to come here to Delaware Bay to stage, but in fact, it doesn't last long, and then it heads north up into the breeding grounds in the far north. And our species, at least our subspecies Rufa, actually winters in Tierra del Fuego. We'll do our best to try to find this bird because we may be watching the end of a subspecies, unfortunately. Birds just don't seem to be able to be stabilizing the population. Another large, medium-sized shorebird is this one. We saw, I think, a couple at Ocean City in the wintertime, but in summertime, it's pretty spectacular. This is a bird now, again, the size of mourning dove, something like that, but a lot fatter. It has an interesting chisel-shaped bill and this beautiful ruddy complexion with the lovely black breastband that goes back and over the back.
It's got calico cat.
Yeah, it looks like, in fact, that's what one of the descriptions says. It looks like the calico cat of shorebirds. Very, very handsome, and it takes advantage of the horseshoe crab phenomenon. So we may see this bird in some numbers, particularly on the coastal part of Delaware. It's a little less common in Bombay Hook. That's a little far inland for turnstones, but I have seen them there, usually one or two. They like, the ruddy turnstone. They like shoreline, and they're particularly fond after the horseshoe crabs are gone. They like rocks, so they're often found on jennings, places like that. We get a few in the winter at Ocean City. Hard to see it on this map, but Ocean City south, if you will, pretty much a coastal bird, except during migration when it actually moves up the Mississippi flyway. Okay. Fairly unmistakable in breeding plumage. In the wintertime, you still see, you don't see the ruddiness and all the color. You still see the hint of that breast band. And that there are no other birds that I know of that have that kind of mark there, so it's fairly easy to tell when you do see it. And it has nice orange legs, which also show up in the winter, which helps as well.
And the white bib under the beak still shows up.
Yeah, the white bib under the beak still shows up. But what you'll probably see in the wintertime is this pattern will catch your eye on a brown and white bird. Again, the size of maybe a little bit smaller than mourning dove. Okay, that's the ruddy turnstone. Then we have two, again, we had challengers like we had with the yellow legs. This is another one. The dowitchers. Yeah. Not dowitchers.
I'm mistaken.
No, it may be a corruption of that, I'm not sure. Dowitchers are about the size of a knot, that is mourning dove size, something like that. Very plump, with an extremely long bill that they use to probe in the mud. And
So
in
they're
breeding,
nosy.
go ahead.
They're nosy.
Yeah, in particular. What I want to show you here is their feeding habits, and then I'll try to tell you what the two species. Short-billed is by far the most common, although even in the short-billed dowitcher, the bill is pretty long. And they feed like a Singer sewing machine. Like that. Okay, they probe in the mud, but it's like this. It's not picking, okay? It's actual probing. Very much like a sewing machine would do. The other dowitcher is called long-billed, and it has a longer bill, but it's not a reliable trait because some long-billed dowitchers and some short-billed dowitchers overlap. But if we go back to this, and I compare the two, long bill. This is non-breeding. Well, here we go. This is a juvenile. I'm going to do the juvenile just because it gets you some idea. Here's a short-billed dowitcher on the left. This is a juvenile long bill on the right. Yeah, the bill is long. The main thing is because they probe deeper, they actually have a little bit more musculature controlling their neck muscles. So the birds have more of a dowitcher's hump. Dowager's hump, whatever you prefer. Slightly also larger in the breast. And so some people who know these birds well will say it looks like it swallowed a ball and the head and tail are stuck on. That would be pretty typical if it's the case. In general, when I'm out with the youth birders, I'm very cautious about identifying long bills. I do look for the long bill just because if I know it's something a lot longer, I'm probably dealing with that, especially if the bird looks real fat. Long
yellow legs,
They have yellowish legs, but not bright. The yellow legs are usually fairly bright. These are kind of greenish yellow. The bird is not as tall as the yellow legs. And the feeding habit, that sewing machine habit, really gives them away, no matter which of the two species it is. Longbills are commoner, and they're not very common, but they're commoner around here in early spring, February and March. They tend to be a more western species overall. So again, people are saying there's a long-billed dowager out here at Bombay Hook. Look, there it is there. Be careful. It's probably not. Short-billed outnumber them, hundreds to one most of the year. But dowager, if you see one in the dead of winter, it's probably a long-bill. Okay, there is to make it worse, short-billed dowagers have a couple of subspecies, one of which is called Griseus, and the Griseus subspecies is redder on the breast than the others. And a typical breeding season long-billed dowager is redder as well. So, it helps, but it's not the be-all and end-all. But that feeding behavior, at least you'll see dowagers, and there are lots over there. There are lots of at Bombay Hook. I saw them last time I was there. Okay, let's see, we're getting down here. I'm going to leave the other two larger shorebirds, which we're not likely to see, and go on to the peeps. So let's start with the semi. Now we're dealing with the small ones. Semi-palmated sandpiper, the one I showed you earlier, that Lynn said was real cute. It is kind of cute. This is a sparrow-sized bird with a slightly heavy bill, not conical like in a sparrow. It's a bird of mudflats, and the legs are dark, and that's key. Also, much of the year, the breast area tends to be lighter than in the other very small shorebirds. The very small shorebirds, sparrow-sized shorebirds, are collectively called by birders peeps. P-E-E-P-S, peeps. And so this is a peep. It's not the smallest peep, but it's pretty close. And it's quite abundant when it's migrating, staging to head up to its northern breeding grounds. We'll see plenty of them here. They tend to be a little bit rustier in the spring, but the breast area tends to be whitish much of the year. Just look at this breeding adult here, you see, and dark legs. The other small peep that looks a lot like it, actually, I can probably get it here, is our smallest common sandpiper. Smallest common peep, I should say.
The least.
All right. This is the semi-palmated in breeding. This is the least. And it is a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch shorter. But the help is if you can see them and they're not covered with mud, the legs are greenish yellow. These are dark. So if you can see any color in the legs on a very small shorebird, i.e. a peep, it's probably a least. The least has a slightly longer bill with a nicer, finer point, and that does show up. And it tends to be scaly across the breast, whereas the semi-palmated often is clear. But the legs, if you can get them, are fine. Sometimes, of course, these sandpipers are in the mud somewhere, and your legs are caked with that, and you can't see the color, then you just throw up your hands in despair. The other thing about the peeps, the small peeps in particular, is that the wings tend to not extend beyond the tail. It gives them a kind of a plumpish appearance. And this is helpful when you get to the slightly bigger peeps. I'll give you an example of one we might show up here. Okay, but these are the ones that cause trouble. Another help for these two birds is that semi-palmated sandpiper is sometimes called the mud peep because it likes mud flats preferably, whereas the least sandpiper sometimes is called the sand peep. If you see them both on a beach, you'll probably find the mud peeps down near the water's edge probing in there, and you'll find the sand peeps up in the duff and above the tide line. That often is helpful. When they start to get into places like Pickering Creek, all bets are off because the habitats aren't quite as segregated as the birds might like them to be. But check the leg color, because if you can see a hint of color, then you're probably looking at a least. All right, I point out that feathering thing. This is something that binoculars don't resolve very well unless the birds are very close. But nonetheless, there are some peeps that are a little bit bigger, and we'll just do this one. We might see this here, I'll watch for it when we're out there. The white rump, the wings are longer than the tail. So the overall impression of this is the gist of the bird, the general impression, size and shape. The general impression is the bird looks a little thinner and longer overall. Legs are dark. It's bigger than the other two that we just did. And so this is called the white rumped sandpiper, and it's less common. Many of them in breeding season show some rust here and rust across the eye, which gives them a kind of a whitish eye line. That sometimes shows up very nicely here. Here's a breeding adult that shows up pretty well. When the bird flies, however, and I guess we'll see if they have, I think they have a map here somewhere. Maps like this. Go to their gallery here. I think they have one in flight. If you can get it to take off or stretch, it has a white rump. The other two don't.
Oh,
Okay.
I wonder what that looks like from underneath.
Yeah. Often they fly low, so you do get a shot at that. Or they may stretch their wings occasionally, and you'll be able to see the whitish rump. You have to be careful. Downwatchers have white rumps too. The rump goes way up, the patch goes way up the middle of the back. So just because you see a white rump, don't call it a white rump sandpiper. But if you see a peep-like sandpiper and you're saying, doesn't quite look like a least, it looks a little bit bigger, looks a little longer, if it flies, then you can confirm that that's what you got. You have to get all of those together.
Oh,
Pardon?
long wings.
The longest wings, that's correct. They're actually a little bit daintier than that. I don't know them so well that I could use that as a field mark, but good for you, because that is also true. They fly quite long distances, so they're not usually, at least here in the East, very common. You'll see the other peeps all over the place.
For little peeps.
Yeah, you will see when we get to Bombay Hook and do our first look at Sheerness Pool, you're going to be amazed what's there. All the same, but I mean, it's just going to be wall to wall, usually at least, semi-palmated sandpipers, and we'll pick out the least and we'll try to find something else. And of course, any big thing is worth looking at twice. So, it's not quite as tough as that, but yeah, when these birds are, staging and harvesting, if you will, ready for their long flight, it can be quite abundant on some of these flags. But it's just there. Move somewhere else and they're not there. So this site fidelity is so important. These staging areas are just not trivial. You can't just go out there and say, God, there's semi-palmated sandpipers everywhere. They'll never go extinct. That's what they said about passenger pigeons. And these are very habitat specific, location specific, and very faithful to them. And any modification of those kinds of habitats without some form of other restitution can be very disastrous, and their population, as we said, is really declining. It's where people are moving and enjoying the view, perhaps, but not necessarily the short terms. The last one, we just have a minute or two. The last one is a common one here that I'll try to wrap up for you. Actually, there are two, but let's take this one first because it's the one you're likely to see. All right, and that is the, we saw this in the winter. It's our palest shorebird in the winter, and sometimes in small flocks of 30 or 40, sometimes just a few. Very pale overall. It's not like a piping plover, and you never see this many piping plovers together in the case. This is on a rock jetty, could be at Ocean City for all I know. It's our very palest one. But the one, if you go to the beach, as some of you have mentioned that you do in Ocean City in August, and see these birds running back and forth with the waves, that's a sand dune.
Oh.
Okay? And this is the color, all right?
Yes.
They're the adults
Oh.
that have come back from the Arctic tundra, leaving their kids behind. And in
What's their situation?
July and August, that's your sandpiper of the beach, okay?
Okay.
As time passes on, other sandpipers begin to come in, other species begin to come in, and these birds lose their ground coloration by late fall and turn into this pale thing. Well, meanwhile, in between, the young start to show up, and they're kind of all over the place in terms of plumage, that sort of thing. But that's your common sandpiper in the summer. We talk about these birds breeding way up in the Arctic. How come we got them in Ocean City? Yeah, we got 1 minute. How come we have them at Ocean City? because the adults are coming back, because the young are precocial.
Uh-huh.
You can leave them behind. So that's your summer shorebird. It's the start of the fall migration, and that starts as early as July. It's possible that the last yellow legs of the spring are flying north at about the same time the first yellow legs of the fall are coming back, and they wave to each other. I won't do Dunlin because we're going to see lots of them there, and we don't have to worry about the identification there. We don't have the time anyway. Those are the amazing shorebirds. If you've not ever seen shorebirds from this type of light before, I hope that this hour and a half has really opened your eyes to just how fantastic they are, how threatened they are, and so much more about bird behavior that's yet to be learned